When you have a material or positional advantage in a chess game, that doesn't mean it's time to relax. You have to be able to convert that advantage into an actual win. You have to stay focused until the very end of the game. The game isn't over until it's over. And that's exactly what we'll be talking about in this video. We'll start with the very basic concepts of converting the win, and then we'll add in some more advanced ideas. So starting off with this example, a lot of times in a game, your advantage will be pretty clear. You will be up some amount of material, and you need to be able to convert that into the actual win. So in this position, we can see that white is up an exchange and a pawn. So that means that white has traded off one of their minor pieces for one of black's rooks, plus has also won an additional pawn. So when you're up on the material in this way, as long as your opponent doesn't have any pressing threats, usually your best course of action is to just trade down. That simply means that we want to force as many trades as possible, because if we imagine near the very end of the game, if equal trades have been made all the way down, right? If queens are off the board, if these two knights are off the board, if these two bishops are off the board, if the rooks get traded, then what are we left with as far as pieces? Well, black would have a single knight and we would have a rook. And as long as most of these pawns are remaining on the board, you would much rather have the rook as opposed to the knight, because the rook simply covers more squares, can move across the board faster, and that's why it's worth more in the material, because it's just usually a better piece. And the additional practical side of trying to trade off all these pieces is that the more pieces that are off the board, the less chance your opponent has for counterplay, so the less chance that they have to potentially win back the material that they've lost. And on the flip side, when you're trying to defend a position like this, when you're the one who's down on the material early in the game, it's usually best to try and keep as many of your attacking pieces on the board as possible for the same reasons, because the more pieces that you have on the board, the more chances there are for you to be able to make some bigger threats. As long as queens remain on the board, there are much more chances for attacking possibilities and even checkmate threats. So what might this look like in the actual game? Well, we could start by developing this bishop. A good square for that, because we want to trade off pieces as fast as possible, might be on e3, of course attacking this bishop. Now, if black wants to hold off on trading those bishops, black can move the bishop over here, but eventually it's kind of going to be forced all the way back, and then of course we can take double black's pawns and we're pretty happy. I think a lot of times the tendency when we go up on the material early in the game is to get extremely aggressive and try and win as soon as possible, because we're winning so clearly, right? But a lot of times it's better to play it slow, actually just trade down the material, and trust that eventually once all the pieces are traded off, you will retain that advantage and it will be much easier to win without having to worry about all your opponent's other pieces making threats of their own. Now let's take a look at this position. So white is currently up a pawn, so that is another slightly smaller material advantage, but black has some threats too. This a pawn is extremely close to promotion, and so as soon as our a pawn is out of the way, black could even consider sacrificing some material here. This a-pawn might get through, and that could be pretty scary. So instead of becoming super focused on winning more material when you already have a material advantage, a lot of times it's equally as important, if not more important, to prevent your opponent's threats before you continue with your own plan. So here we could take and win this pawn, right, because it's attacked by so many things, but then black will be able to take the a-pawn for free, and this pawn promotion again will become a very serious threat. So instead, we can start by taking this bishop with the knight, since it might be able to cover some squares along this long diagonal. After black recaptures, then we can protect this pawn, not necessarily by bringing our rook to this really ugly square, but instead, since these rooks are lined up, we can simply bring one of them down and block this rook's attack on our a-pawn. And it's important to note that we are still going to eventually win this pawn. This pawn isn't going anywhere. All of black's pawns are extremely weak, and so they will eventually become targets, but it's important to defend against our opponent's threats first and foremost before we start making more threats of our own. Now in this example, we're even further into the endgame where both sides only have rooks, and in fact, we're playing with the black pieces and we're actually down on the material, but our positional advantage is such that black is actually winning in this position. And a lot of times people talk about positional advantage earlier in the middle game, but it can come up in the end game as well, and in this case, this pawn is so far advanced, it's only 2 squares away from promotion, that white on the last move couldn't even afford to take this pawn. They had to move to this other side so that they could eventually go back up to the back rank and defend against this promotion. There's even an important advantage in where our king is placed, right? Because ideally white would like to put their rook here and defend against this pawn promotion from behind, But because the king is right there, of course, the rook can't go to this ideal square, so instead they have to kind of go around and defend this way, and it's going to be really difficult for the white king to get over in time, and this rook is just going to simply move over, push the pawn up, and it will be a very quick win, even though white has 3 pawns to our 2. So what does this look like? Well, if it's black to move, black has a couple of options here. All of them are kind of forcing, right? We could take this pawn with check, we could push e2 and force the rook to go back here right away. What we wouldn't want to do is something slow, right? This is a very critical position, and because the king is so far away, if we make one wrong move, like just moving this pawn up, all of a sudden the king can get closer, defending this pawn and attacking the rook. It's also getting closer to being able to help stop this e-pawn from eventually promoting. And so this would be a mistake because we're not taking advantage of the positional advantage that we have. So instead, I think the easiest is just simple chess. The most forcing move, of course, is to take this pawn with check. It does allow the king to get a little bit closer, but then we can move back, go behind the pawn, essentially force this rook onto the back rank. We can push the pawn, pretty much force the rook here again, and now it's stuck on this square because as soon as it moves, we'll push the pawn through and suddenly white will be losing the rook. Then the plan here to retain this positional advantage would be to get our king as active as possible, move it up here, go after the b pawn, and then potentially even push the a pawn. Even if we end up losing this pawn, it's going to take white a few moves to get there, and so if we can move in, make our king extremely active, make it a problem for white to have to deal with, that's the way we convert a position like this. Now, in our first example, I talked about how it's usually advantageous for the person who's up material to trade pieces off until you eventually reach the ideal endgame where you just have a clear material advantage and your opponent just has no pieces to make additional threats. But in some cases like this one, where there are very few pawns left on the board, if we imagine all these pieces get traded off, the bishops for bishops, rooks for rooks, and if we imagine all the pawns also off the board, then black would just be left with a single knight, and you can't checkmate with just a knight. So a lot of times, especially later in the game, like I said, when there's not that many pawns on the board and white might have the option to just get rid of all the pawns, that's the time where the defending side usually wants to actually trade off the pieces. But in this case, that only works if black isn't able to hold on to at least one of the pawns. So let's take a look. So if white trades off the rook, we take the rook. If the bishop gets traded, we can take the bishop. And now going back to evaluating our strengths in the position and making them even stronger. Well, what is white's strength in this position? Well, clearly the only hope that white really has is this little pawn that could, the outside passer. But white will have to contend with our passed pawn as well, and white really doesn't want to let this pawn promote because imagining we get 2 queens on the board, the knight actually becomes a lot stronger in that case because there's more potential for tricks and forks, and it's just covering a few more squares than our opponent would. So white, again, trying to draw this game, goes after the pawn. Black can push and defend it with the knight. White can move up again. And now there's a couple of things we need to keep in mind. We need to make sure that our king eventually is going to be able to stop this passed pawn once it starts moving forward. We can also start trading off pawns over here. So let's say GH, GH. We can push H5 and sort of force white to show their cards. Probably white's best try here is simply to push the a-pawn with potentially the hope that the black king will forget about it or not get there in time. But of course, we can just play king d6. If a6, we can stay in the pawn square. And now black can just keep the king here, and as soon as the pawn moves forward, we can simply move in and catch it. So this might be a good time for white to move in and attack the knight and the pawn. Black, at this point, does not want to give up the knight because it still has the potential to help out with winning some of these leftover pawns. And black might see, okay, I can go here with check, also an attack on the pawn, so it's going to be winning this passed pawn. White takes the pawn, black takes the pawn. But now if you know your endgames, the white king is actually much closer to this side of the board where the pawns are, and at this point, black doesn't have any other hope except for this one lonely pawn, because as soon as it's gone, again, black cannot checkmate with just the knight. And if we play this out, as soon as the black pawn is off the board, suddenly it's black fighting for the draw. Of course, because it's a rook pawn, if, again, you know your endgames, black will be able to hold this draw simply by forcing the white king to stay in the corner, or if the white king moves, going into the corner ourselves, and there's just no way for this pawn to promote. Eventually we can move the knight, kind of force the king to move away and take the pawn, but this is a draw. So where did this all go wrong? Actually, it was all the way back here when black made this sort of impatient move of checking with the knight. In an endgame like this, it's very important not to have your king and your one remaining piece doing the same job. The king is doing a great job of holding off this pawn. There's no way it's ever going to promote as long as we stay in this vicinity. And so actually, instead of giving this check, the knight would have been better placed on the other side of the board doing its work over here. So we can start with the move knight e1 check, and after the king takes, now we have this fork winning the h-pawn, and suddenly it's going to be a lot more difficult for white to get rid of our h-pawn. And that might seem a little bit counterintuitive because after the king moves closer, we can take the pawn, the king can move closer again, we can actually give this check, and if the king moves down here, well, it looks like it's forking it, but we can actually leave the knight undefended at this point and move the pawn up. The pawn is now defended by the knight, and if the king takes our knight, the king is outside of the pawn square, and it will not be able to catch up as we push the pawn and promote. So backing up a little bit, the king actually is better served going in front of the pawn and trying to hold on as long as possible, something like king g3. We can push our passer, and again, if the king goes down here and tries to win the knight, we always have this option of pushing the pawn as soon as the king is outside of the pawn square. And in the event that the king just waits around, now is the time for us to go after this a-pawn. And it's all about patience here. As the white king shuffles back and forth, the black king can do its job over here, and now we can march all the way back, essentially shoulder the king out of the way, use our knight to get the king out of the corner, and slowly move our pawn up. We can even go here, and we don't have to worry about stalemate with the king in the corner because we actually have mate in one with the knight. So this was a pretty long example, but it illustrates some very important concepts. And that's knowing our strengths and knowing which ones are important. In this case, knowing that we had to hang on to a pawn and that the knight was not enough to win the game. Also holding off our opponent's potential threats, like the threat of the passed pawn pushing on the a-file. And also not losing focus because, as you can see, even though black was up a minor piece, in this particular endgame, white had very many fighting chances to potentially go for a draw, and if we weren't careful and if we weren't accurate, there was definitely potential to throw away that winning advantage. And also a final note, when you're on the defending side of these types of positions, don't give up so early. Keep a winning or a drawing mindset and just play the best and most accurate moves that you can, because there's always chances for a comeback. Thanks so much for watching. If you like this video, please consider subscribing and let me know what other kinds of chess content you'd like to see. I'll see you soon.